In the spring of 1869, the Oregon frontier felt raw and worn out. A tiny trading post sat on the trail like a scar, just a few weathered buildings and wagons pressed in by tall, dark pines. Smoke, sweat, and horse smell hung in the air while men circled a rough wooden platform for the last auction of the day. They were hard men with tired faces. Beards ran wild, hands were cracked, and eyes looked hollow from long winters and longer loneliness. Some nudged each other and laughed. Some spat in the mud. Some just stared at the stage like they were waiting for trouble, just to feel something. On the platform stood a man in a faded vest with a dull badge on his chest. He slammed a wooden mallet on a post and called for quiet. Then he told them what he had to sell. A woman brought west with a sack over her head. A woman who would work and obey. No past, no questions, no proper name. He said the starting price was $2 to any man willing to marry a stranger he could not even see. Laughter cracked through the crowd. Men shouted crude guesses about what waited under the sack. Some said she must be ugly. Some said she was cursed. One joked that she was probably already dead, and they were just selling the trouble. A few men shook their heads and stepped back like they were better than the whole thing, but nobody left. Everyone wanted to watch. The woman stood barefoot and still. Dust streaked her ankles. Her hands were tied in front with rough rope that had rubbed her wrists raw. The sack over her head was stained and too big, pulled tight at the neck so every breath made the cloth move. Her fingers trembled, then locked again. She did not speak. She did not fight. She just kept standing, as if falling would be the same as giving up the last piece of herself. The man with the badge called for a bid. No one answered. A wagon creaked behind the crowd. A restless horse stamped. The silence stretched long and mean. The auctioneer muttered that she was no use if she would not talk, and said maybe they should send her on to a mining camp where men cared less what they were buying. Then the crowd shifted without anyone saying a word. Men stepped aside as a lone figure walked forward from the back. His boots were heavy with mud. His canvas coat carried stains of sap and sawdust. His hat shaded most of his face, but what showed looked steady instead of cruel. In one hand he carried an axe with its handle wrapped in dark leather. In a low, even voice, he offered $2. The sound cut clean through the restless noise and brought a hush that felt almost strange. The auctioneer stared and asked if he was sure. The man did not look around for approval. He only said he meant it. A few men snickered and called him desperate for company, but no one stepped in his way. The auctioneer warned him that he did not even want to see the woman's face first. The stranger looked toward the still shape with the sack over her head. He answered that he was not buying a face. He was taking a person as his wife. The words landed heavy in the dusty air. For the first time all afternoon, no one laughed. The rest went fast. The stranger gave his name as Silas Boone, a lumberjack from the woods north of the ridge. The man with the badge scratched a few lines on a scrap of paper and declared the marriage lawful in the eyes of the territory and under heaven. Silas signed with a steady hand. Then came the moment that would change his life. The auctioneer turned to the woman and told her she was now wed and must say her name for the record. For a long breath, nothing happened. Only the creak of boards and the soft rush of wind. Then the sack shifted as she drew in air. Her voice came out rough from disuse, but steady enough. She said her name was Annabelle Crow. The sound of it ran straight through Silas like a strike of cold water. His body went still. His eyes widened for a heartbeat, then settled as he pulled his face back into calm. Because he knew that voice. He knew it from a brutal winter 3 years before, when he had gone too far into the high timber and broken his leg on a frozen slope. He had lain in the snow, staring at a sky that blurred in and out, certain he would die there. Then rough hands had dragged him to a hidden cave. A small fire. Bitter medicine. Careful fingers wrapping his leg. A woman with her face covered, who spoke in that same quiet voice and would not give a name. By the time the storm passed, she was gone. All that remained was a small scrap of cloth with purple flowers stitched into it. Silas had carried that cloth in his coat ever since. Now, on a rough wooden stage in a harsh little outpost, that same voice had finally spoken a name. Silas stepped down from the platform and moved to her side. He did not yank her or drag her. He took the rope at her wrists in one strong hand and led her away from the crowd with a steady grip that felt more like shelter than ownership. The men watched them go, but for once no one had a joke sharp enough to throw. If this story is touching your heart already, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and if you have ever gone through something similar. Also, tell me what you would like me to improve in future stories. Silas and Annabelle left the trading post as the day leaned toward evening. Behind them, the noise of men and wagons faded fast. Soon there was only the crunch of their steps and the slow beat of the old mule's hooves. The wide road narrowed into a trail and slipped into the tall pines. Silas walked in front with the mule rope in his hand. He moved like a man used to distance and work. He did not speak. Now and then he checked that Annabelle followed. She walked a few paces behind, the sack tight around her head, wrists still wrapped in the same worn rope. Her steps were small but steady. She did not ask where they were going. The forest closed around them. The air cooled and smelled of sap and damp dirt. Sometimes Annabelle's fingers moved against the rope like they wanted to reach for something that was gone. Her shoulders stayed high and tight, ready for the next harsh word or hand. She held her chin low so the sack would not shift. Hiding had become its own kind of shield. By the time they reached his cabin, the sky had turned flat gray. Silas's place sat in a small clearing against a low rise of earth. It was built from dark logs, plain but solid, with a stone chimney on one side and a stack of split wood by the door. Silas opened the door and stepped aside. His voice came low as he told her she could stand wherever she wished. Annabelle stepped inside. She did not explore. She moved straight to the far wall, lowered herself down, and sat with her back to the logs, knees pulled up, sack still on. Silas followed and set their bundle on the table. Then he knelt and worked at the knot on her wrists. He loosened the rope with slow fingers. When it fell away, thin red marks showed around her skin. For a moment her hand rested in his palm. He felt the fine tremor there before she pulled back and wrapped her arms around herself again. He did not press her with talk. He went to the small iron stove and began to cook. Water in the pot. A handful of dried beans, a strip of salt pork, a few scraps of dried vegetable, a pinch of herbs. Soon the cabin filled with a thick smell of stew. The only sounds were the clink of his spoon and the snap of fire. When the food was ready, he filled 2 wooden bowls. One he set on the table in front of the lone chair. The other he carried across the room and placed on the floor beside her, close enough to reach. Annabelle flinched when she felt him near, then went still when he stepped away. Silas sat at the table, hands around his own bowl, eyes on the fire, not on her. For a while nothing happened. Then her voice came from under the sack, low and unsure. She asked what kind of meal this was. Silas answered that it was what he made after the hardest days in the woods, a meal for the last one standing. He added that he had kept making 2 bowls even when no one else sat at the table. Those plain words settled between them. Annabelle reached for the bowl at her side and drew it into her lap. She did not lift the sack. She slid the spoon up under the cloth and ate in slow, careful bites. When she finished, she set the empty bowl down with both hands like she was placing something fragile. Later, Silas washed the dishes in a tin basin near the stove. Annabelle stayed by the wall, arms around her knees, eyes on his back. Her body was still tight, but the small shaking that had followed her from the auction was gone. When the cabin quieted and the fire settled to a low red glow, Silas sat on a stool in front of the hearth. His thoughts slid back 3 winters. He saw again the high ridge where he had walked too far in deep snow, the sudden slide, the sharp twist in his leg, the hard hit of rock and ice. The cold had pressed into his chest until each breath felt thin. Then hands had gripped his coat and dragged him across frozen ground. He woke in a shallow cave hidden behind a sheet of ice. A small fire burned near the back wall. A woman moved beside it with her face covered by rough cloth, like the sack that now wrapped Annabelle's head. Her voice had been steady and calm. She held a cup to his mouth and told him to drink the bitter mix inside. Pine bark and old moss, anything to fight the fever. She wrapped his leg and set warm stones along it. All through that storm, she kept the fire alive. When he was strong enough to walk, she was gone. Only the low coals and a small square of fabric remained, folded neat by his side. Purple flowers, uneven and simple, had been stitched into it. He had folded that cloth and tucked it inside his coat, where it still rested over his heart. Now that same voice sat only a few feet away in his own cabin, hidden under a sack, with a name he had finally heard on that rough wooden stage, Annabelle Crow. He did not tell her that he knew. Not yet. Shelter had to come before questions. He turned his head and watched her shape against the far wall. She had slipped into sleep, sitting up, chin on her knees, one hand resting open at her side. Silas reached into his coat and touched the folded scrap with the purple flowers. In that small cabin deep in the Oregon woods, two people who had once almost died alone now shared the same circle of light. It was not trust yet, and not love, but it was the first steady step toward both. Morning came soft to the ridge, pale light slid between the pines, and a thin mist hugged the ground. Annabelle stepped outside. The sack was still tied over her head, but her walk was steadier than the night before. She crossed to a tall pine at the edge of the clearing, lowered herself onto its roots, and leaned her back against the trunk. For a while, she sat without moving. Then both hands lifted to her neck. Her fingers found the knot, worked it loose, and slid the sack up just enough to free her mouth and nose. Cold air touched bare skin. She turned her face toward the weak sun and drew a slow breath. Across the clearing, Silas knelt beside a basin, oiling the teeth of his saw. He watched her from the corner of his eye but did not move closer. Instead, he spoke in a calm, even voice that carried just far enough. He said that one winter he had gone too deep into the hills for timber, been caught in a storm, and broken his leg on the ice. He had thought he would die until a woman dragged him into a hidden cave, kept a small fire going, set his leg, and poured bitter medicine down his throat. Her face had been covered, her name unknown, but her voice had stayed with him. The voice he heard on the auction stage, he said, had sounded just like hers. Annabelle did not answer. Then she pulled the sack all the way off and set it in her lap. Silas turned his head and saw her fully for the first time. She was not ruined. She was simply marked. A long, pale scar curved from her right temple down along her cheek. It was an old wound, healed but deep. Her eyes locked on his, waiting for the flinch she had seen so many times before. It did not come. His gaze stayed steady. Her words came slowly as she told him about the boarding house back east, where she had worked for food and a narrow bed. The owner had said her room depended on her doing more than scrubbing pots. She had refused. One night he cornered her in a back room. He grabbed. She fought, and in the struggle he slipped and smashed his head on the iron stove. He died on that floor. His family called her wicked before anyone heard her side. No one in the house spoke up. The town took the easy story. They named her the killer, not the girl who had tried to protect herself. She said she had no money, no kin, no power. They covered her face with a sack so people would not have to look at the scar, and sent her west as payment on the dead man's debts. Men traded her from wagon to wagon like she was freight instead of flesh. Every stop meant new hands, new stairs, the same rough rope at her wrists. The sack had started as someone else's idea. After a while she clung to it. It turned her into something vague and nameless. That hurt, but it felt safer than being seen and judged at a glance. By the time she reached the Oregon post, she no longer felt like a person at all. Silas stood and brushed his hands on his trousers. He walked a little closer, careful not to crowd her. In a low, firm voice, he told her he believed her, and that she had done what anyone would do when cornered and afraid. He said the wrong done to her was real, and that the scar on her face was not a stain, but proof she had fought to stay alive. Annabelle dropped her gaze. Tears slid down over the scar and fell into the dirt. For the first time in a long while, someone had heard her whole story and had not turned away. Later that day, after she washed at the basin and combed her hair, she stepped into the main room of the cabin and stopped. On the table by the window sat a small upright mirror, polished clean. Next to it lay a folded scarf of soft green cloth. She walked to the table as if the mirror might bite. For months she had avoided her own reflection, catching only quick shapes in dark water. Now the glass held her full image in the clear light. She forced herself to look. The scar showed sharp and honest. So did the tired lines around her eyes. But she also saw something new. There was a set to her chin that spoke of stubborn life. Her shoulders were not as small. She picked up the scarf. The fabric slid between her fingers like cool water. She wrapped it around her head and tied it at the side, letting some hair show and leaving the scar in plain view. This was not a hiding cloth like the sack. This was a frame she chose for herself. In the doorway, Silas watched her. He told her that scarf had belonged to his late wife, who had worn it on days when the world felt heavy. He said he thought it might help Annabelle remember that she was more than the pain she carried. Annabelle looked into the mirror again. With the scarf resting soft around her hair and the light warming her skin, she looked like a woman who had walked through fire and come out standing. The scar was still there, but now it sat on a face that held quiet pride. She raised her hand and pressed her fingers flat against the glass, where her reflection's cheek showed the long, pale line. She did not turn away. A slow, steady breath left her chest. Outside, the wind stirred the branches. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a lone rider made his way up the trail toward the logging camp, following a rumor about a scarred woman in the woods. Trouble was coming. But inside the small cabin, Annabelle Crow stood in front of a mirror, learning again how to be herself. The quiet life Annabelle and Silas had made in the clearing did not stay their secret. Out here, news rode on wagon wheels and bar talk, and sooner or later it found unfriendly ears. A lean stranger came to the logging camp one dusty afternoon. He walked into the saloon, shook off the trail, and looked around like he was weighing every man in the room. He called himself Cutter and said he needed work, but his real business was questions. He asked about a woman with a long scar on her right cheek, a woman who used to hide her face in burlap, and about a lumberjack who lived too far from town. Men tried to joke and shrug him off, but their eyes moved. Cutter watched those small shifts and smiled without joy. He hunted people for pay. And, somewhere back east, a notice still named Annabelle Crow a murderer. He meant to drag her back in irons and get his money. By nightfall, a camp hand who liked Silas more than trouble saddled up and rode hard to the cabin. He told Silas about the stranger with cold, gray eyes and too many questions. When the man left, Silas dropped the bar across the door and turned toward Annabelle. She stood by the stove with her hand on the table. She had lived long enough to know danger without seeing it. Silas told her someone was hunting her name. For a long breath, she stared at the coals, then walked to the wooden chest at the foot of the bed. Inside, folded tight, lay the old sack. She picked it up and held it like a memory. She said she would wear it one last time, not to hide who she was, but so they could choose the ground where this would end. Fear still lived in her, but there was steel beside it now. They talked until the fire sank low. By the time the last log settled, they had a plan. At first light, Annabelle would ride out alone on the old fire road, sack over her head, an easy trail for a hunter. Cutter would follow. Silas would cut across the ridge, bring the sheriff and 2 men he trusted, and meet them at a narrow pass where rock walls closed in. Dawn came clear and cold. Annabelle tied the sack with steady fingers. The green scarf stayed on its peg. She saddled Silas's spare horse and climbed up. For a moment Silas rested his hand on her boot, not to hold her back, just to let her feel she was not alone. She said she was done running, and turned the horse toward the trees. Everything unfolded the way they hoped. Cutter saw her leave and shadowed her from the pines, never far and never close, like a wolf pacing its prey. Annabelle kept a steady pace along the rutted road. The trail narrowed, walls of rock rising on both sides. When Cutter rode into the tight pass, 3 rifles swung toward him from the stones. The sheriff called him out for stalking and hunting a woman who had never had a fair voice before the law. Cutter grabbed for his revolver, but he was not faster than 3 ready rifles. His gun hit the dirt, and ropes took his wrists. From up on the rocks, Annabelle watched with her heart pounding. When it was done and Cutter was tied to his own saddle, she rode down. Silas stepped forward and helped her to the ground. She untied the sack and pulled it off. Dust streaked her hair, but her eyes were clear. She looked at the cloth in her hands. She said it had saved her again, not by hiding her, but because this time she had used it as a tool instead of letting it use her. When Silas asked what she would do with it now, she folded it tight and tucked it under her arm. She said she would keep it as proof that even old chains could become a shield when she chose them herself. Cutter was taken away to meet his own charges. For once, the law was aimed in the right direction. Some weeks later, a soft knock tapped at the cabin door. It came slow, like the hand behind it was not sure it had the right. Silas opened the door and found a woman on the step. Her dress was worn, her boots stained from long roads, and she held her hat in both hands. She said her name was Mavis Green, and that she used to cook at the boarding house where Annabelle had worked. When Annabelle stepped into view, Mavis's eyes filled with guilt and something like courage. She said she had heard more that night than she had ever admitted. She had heard the fight and the crash, had seen Annabelle's bruises, and had stayed quiet because she was scared of losing her job and her only bed. She said she was tired of being silent. They sat together at the table with coffee between them. Mavis told the whole story, detail by detail, voice steady now that she had started. Silas wrote every word in a strong hand. When he finished, Mavis signed at the bottom and straightened her shoulders. The sheriff took that paper and rode out toward the nearest judge. The seasons shifted. Snow melted into the dark earth. New green pushed up through old needles. One clear morning, the sheriff rode back up the path with an envelope in his vest. He handed it to Annabelle and stood quiet while she opened it on the porch. The letter was short, but it felt heavy in her hands. The court dropped the charges. The warrant was gone. Her name no longer sat on a wanted notice nailed to some far rail. She let out a breath she had been holding for years and walked down to the tall pine at the edge of the clearing. Sitting at its roots, she pressed the paper to her chest and whispered that she did not have to run any more. Spring settled deep into the ridge. With spare boards and gentle patience, Silas built a small arch beside the cabin, 4 posts and a beam wrapped in plain cloth. Wildflowers pushed up around its feet like they wanted to watch. On the day they chose, a handful of friends came in from town. Mavis wore her best dress. The blacksmith brought a small jug of apple drink. The sheriff had his badge polished and his shirt clean. They did not bring fine gifts. They brought witness. Inside, Annabelle stood before the familiar mirror. It no longer scared her. It simply showed a woman who knew what she had lived through and who she had become. She wore a plain cream dress she had sewn herself. In her hands she held the old sack. She and Silas had washed it, cut it, and stitched the edges with little purple flowers like the ones on the scrap he had carried from that winter cave. The rough cloth that once hid her had become a short veil. She set it over her hair so it framed her scar instead of hiding it. When she stepped outside, the forest went quiet for a breath. Under the arch, Silas waited in his cleanest shirt, beard trimmed, boots brushed as best he could. When he saw her, his eyes turned soft and steady. She walked to him, and they joined hands, calloused palm to calloused palm. There was no preacher, only the sheriff, a few friends, and the tall pines around them. Silas promised to stand by the real woman beside him, not the lies others had written about her. Annabelle promised to stand by the man who had seen her when she could not even stand to see herself, the man who had turned his own pain into a quiet place of safety. They sealed their vows with a small, sure kiss. A light rain drifted through the branches, soft as a blessing. Mavis wiped her eyes and said she never thought she would see the day when an old burlap sack turned into the finest veil she had ever seen. The blacksmith nodded and said it was fine because of who wore it, not because of what it used to be. That night, after the last riders faded into the trees and the woods settled back into their soft hum, Silas and Annabelle sat together on the porch steps. The veil lay folded in her lap. She traced the stitched flowers with one finger and said this scrap once meant fear and shame. Now it meant choice, courage, and a home she had helped build. Silas laced his fingers through hers. Above them, the sky stretched wide and clear. The scar on her cheek caught the faint light, not as a mark of what had been done to her, but as a sign of what she had survived. In that quiet clearing in the Oregon woods, a lonely lumberjack and the woman he had once bought for $2 had turned their worst chains into something sacred. Their love did not fix every hurt or erase every memory. It did something harder. It took each broken piece and laid them together into a life that held not just pain, but peace. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more emotional Wild West stories that will touch your soul.